So why do we need to bring Helen Keller back? We live in turbulent times right now. Why would it be important to bring Helen Keller back into the public eye? Why is she still a role model for the entire planet? And why do we have to keep telling her story as each new generation comes on to the planet? So I wrote two books in 2021 about Helen Keller. I wrote The Esoteric Helen Keller. It's part of a series called Nights for the Blind in the Battle Against Darkness. And I wrote a second book called Helen Keller's A Timeline of Her Life. I read everything about Helen Keller. It took me 2 years, and I summarized everything that I had read, and I put it in that timeline. I also taught blind children for 30 years. Some of the children were hearing impaired, a few were deaf. So I'm going to use my experience here, and I'm going to, in the time together that we have together, I want to share with you a top 10 list. 10 reasons to bring Helen Keller back and to keep her in the public eye. So this is not a crescendo list where I get to number one, the number one most important reason. These are 10 very interesting reasons, I think, for bringing her back. I really enjoyed putting this list together. It was fun. So before I get to the list, I want to talk about a friend of Helen Keller's, William James, who was a professor at Harvard. There is a high-rise at Harvard called the William James building, and Harvard knew that they had a remarkable man here in William James. James wrote a 1,000-page book called the Principles of Psychology. He wrote it in 1891. It's in small print. It's an amazing book, and people still read that book. But it was on the basis of that book and on other books that he wrote and on his lectures that he became known as the father of American psychology. So there was no psychology in America until that book was written and until William James began to tell us that we needed to understand how our behaviors and we had to understand how our mind worked. So he defined this field called psychology. And I wanted to start with William James because of something he said that impacted me as a young man. I probably said this 100 years ago. He said that every human being, just as we need water and food and shelter, we need to be acknowledged. And there's other words for that. We need to be seen. We need to be appreciated. We need to hear from other people that we have value. And so I think about that when I give presentations because I want to say that I know that the audience here is a sophisticated audience. I know that you're a compassionate group. You wouldn't be here unless that was the case. So I acknowledge who you are, and I'm honored to be speaking with you. I also like to say that we're now a member of a team, part of the Helen Keller Spiritual Life Collaborative. And that feels really good because it's a very healthy creation here. And to be part of it is a privilege. And we're all in this together. So we can acknowledge this new organization that we're part of. And things like this don't come out of the blue. They come from a visionary, and the visionary is Reverend Sage Cole in this case. And it's not just that you create an idea like this, it's that you have the courage to actually make it happen. Lots of people have good ideas, but very few go through the process of making their mission into a reality. And Sage has done that. And then there's the everyday problem of keeping it going, of throwing the wood on the fire and not letting it die out. And so thank you, Sage. You're loved, and we care deeply about what you've done, and we feel privileged to be part of it. So let's go back to William James. I like this story about William James. It's delightful. He's the father of American psychology, so he's interested in how the mind works, and he finds out that Helen Keller is now at the Perkins School for the Blind in Watertown, Massachusetts, which is very close to Harvard. So he makes an arrangement, and he's going to go see Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan, and he takes along one of his most accomplished graduate students, a guy working on his PhD. who I'll tell you about in a minute. So he shows up, and I want you to think about this for a moment. He shows up at the Perkins School for the Blind, and here he is. He's the father of American psychology, but not yet. Okay, that's yet to happen. And he's sitting across from a miracle and a miracle worker, and they haven't happened yet either. And then this fourth guy turns out to be William Edward Dubois. That's a French pronunciation of his name. But Dubois turns out to be the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. He goes on to co-found the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He's one of the original civil rights workers in America. And we're talking 1891 when they meet. So these four people have a battle ahead. I mean, we were just talking about being appreciated and being seen, and you've got an African American here who understands the situation in America. So it's a remarkable moment, and these people would have no clue that we would be talking about them now. They impacted the whole planet, all four of them. So William James brings a present for Helen Keller. He brings an ostrich feather. He knows what he's doing when he brings the ostrich feather. First of all, it's a good gift for somebody who's deaf-blind, but also the ostrich feather is a symbol. And it's been a symbol for at least 5,000 years. It goes back to the Egyptians. And different cultures have given it different powers or different significance. But essentially, it boils down to this. The ostrich feather is a symbol for love, for truth, and for justice. Yes, and so that's exactly what Sage has said to us, Reverend Cole. She says, here's your guidepost. Here is your direction, your motto, whatever you want to call it. But you're to be love, and you're to be honest, and you're to be useful. And I was thinking about that, and I thought, well, maybe we'll just get an ostrich feather, and that would be a good symbol for our organization. It goes back all the way to 1891 in that meeting. Just one more thing about William James, and it's a good segue into the first of this 10 list that I have. So it turns out that his father is Henry James Sr. His brother is Henry James, the famous novelist. But Henry James Sr. turns out to be a Swedenborgian scholar, which when I first read that, I was just amazed that that was the case. And he wrote a book about Swedenborg. He published in journals. He gave lectures. And so Emanuel Swedenborg is part of this whole top 10 list here, because you can't separate out Helen Keller from Emanuel Swedenborg if you're talking about spiritual development. It's not possible. She was reading Swedenborg when she was a teenager. She read all these complex books, which if you looked at the books, they're very complex. And so she absorbed those books. So you can't separate the two out. So there's so much to go here, where to go considering the bulk of material that Swedenborg produced. But there was one thing that stood out because I wrote about it myself in the Esoteric Helen Keller. And it's this idea that there are levels of spiritual development, and we're somewhere on this path. And that's what we want to keep here. We want to bring this to each generation, that there is such a thing as a spiritual path. So I'm talking to these audiences about Swedenborg, and they suddenly wake up and they lean in. And because I start talking about Swedenborg's ability to go out, to travel outside the body, to have experiences where he goes to heaven and he goes to hell and he talks to angels, he talks to demons. You can do what you want with that. You can be skeptical if you're a scientist. You do what you want with it. But he came back and he said to people, the angel said to me, don't take the Bible literally. The Bible is a very powerful document. It is allegorical, mythological. It's full of symbolism, but it also is a guideline for how you go from a low level of consciousness to Christ consciousness. to nirvana, to enlightenment. You're moving up the pathway here. And Swedenborg laid this out. So it's a good time to make a confession. I am not an expert in this. That would be the Swedenborgians like Reverend Cole. So I can't go into depth about the levels that he found. I can tell you that going back into history, he was drawing on something that already existed. Pre-science, the scientific, the alchemists, the Rosicrucians, the Masons, going back with their 33 levels of development. There are all these depictions of, you see these pictures, they're ladders, and then there's a platform, that's a level of consciousness or spiritual development, and then there's another ladder and a platform, another ladder. Sometimes it's steps. But what I like is the spiral. And the image I want you to think of is like a funnel. And there's a narrow end of the funnel and a high end of the funnel. The high end of the funnel is Christ consciousness, enlightenment. And the lowest part is the beginning of the pathway that we're supposed to be on. So down there at the very beginning are narcissistic minds. And we're all narcissistic. There isn't anybody on the planet who isn't narcissistic. And what I mean by that is because we have vision and hearing, because of all of our sensory abilities that give us the reality that we see, we are under the impression that we're the center of the universe. The whole universe is looking at us, right? We're it. If we go over there to Texas, wherever we go, India, we're still the center of the universe. So that's a very powerful feeling. Wow, it's all about me. Look at that. Wow, it's all about me. And that's the beginning. That's the first step of the journey. The next step up there is to realize that everybody you see thinks that they're the center of the universe, right? And you have to get your mind around that. And then these levels go up. The modern level of consciousness, that's this world that you see, okay? Okay, this is reality, right? This is it. This is the way things are. You can see it, I can see it, and this is it. This is modern level. The scientists are working to figure it out, and they're doing their reductionist stuff, and there's theories, and we're trying to figure out this world. But that's a level of consciousness. That's not very high up. You have to spin up a little bit higher, and then suddenly that world that we see all around us gets really suspect. It's like there's something else going on here. So the thing to understand is that as you go up, you transcend, but you include. You don't ever stop being a narcissist. You just are. And so you move up through these levels, but you don't forget where you came from. So here's an easy way to understand this. You know it in your heart because you were a human. You are a human being, and you went through every year you were different. Go look at the album, year one, year two, you're a different person every single year. And the way that scientists thought about it for a long time was, okay, so you get to be in your 20s and now you have an adult mind, actually it's all downhill from here because, that's as far as the brain develops. But that didn't turn out to be true. What turned out to be the case was that you could take the so-called adult mind in your 20s and you could use that mind to mold itself. You could create, it takes effort when you're in your 20s to go higher up on those levels. You don't automatically go up the levels like you did when you were a kid from year to year. Now, in your 20s, you begin to do the work that you need to do to move up the ladder. Okay, that's all I'll say about that. It's very complex. It's also very fun because where are you on it? We're all somewhere on this scale of development. So, number 2, okay? So think of that funnel again. Helen Keller said to us that your audience, who you're talking to, is the whole human race. Okay? You want a tribe to belong to? You do belong to a tribe. It's called the human race. You belong to humanity. That's your group. Okay? So think about Helen Keller for a minute. She's deaf-blind, right? She can't see, she can't hear, totally. So she could have spent her whole life, her entire existence, fighting for deafblind individuals to be seen and valued. Okay? And she did. But that's not all she did. She transcended that. She could have been a fighter for people who are deaf or a fighter for people who are blind, and she did. Okay? But she transcended that. And then she could have been a spokesperson for all disabilities, and she was. But she transcended that. She could have been a fighter for women's rights her whole life, and she was her whole life, but she transcended that. And she could have been a, a fighter for civil rights. She could have been, and she was, for a while anyway, a socialist, which makes people nuts nowadays. But she was a socialist. And the reason she was a socialist was because she lived at an early time in the late 80s when the industrial world was brutal. People were dying in factories. There was a class division between the super, super rich and the super, super poor. It was a terrible situation. It's still there in our culture, but it was very acute when Helen Keller was a young woman. And so she became a socialist because it meant she was fighting against this class struggle, okay? But then she transcended that. She represented all of those groups, but then she traveled all over the world and she spoke to many, many different cultures. And she knew that what she was doing was speaking to the entire human race, that was her tribe. And that's her message to us. All right, number 3, Helen Keller's an optimist. So think about that for a minute. So she's born like 15 years after the Civil War has ended. Civil War is still on people's minds in 1880 when she's born. She sees World War I. She sees the Great Depression. She sees World War II. She sees the Cold War. She sees the Korean War. She sees the war in Vietnam. She died in 1968. So she sees that women can't vote, not until she's in her 20s. She sees the state of African American people in this country. It's abhorrent. So she's got every reason to be a pessimist. You know, there's just war everywhere. She's got every reason to be depressed. The first book she wrote was called Optimism, and she wrote it when she was a college student at Radcliffe. So how in the world, how can you be an optimist under these conditions? It's still going on. This planet is still a mess. Okay, and so how do we take her message and still be an optimist? What's that about? And I think the answer to that is that Helen Keller knew the difference between belief and faith. And it was faith that was driving her optimism. And I'll talk about that more later. Her message is be an optimist. So number 4, the other ones you might have thought about, but this one maybe not. So she goes to a party when she's 14 years old in New York City. And there's a guy at the party, and she's talking to the guy, and his name is Mark Twain. And these two hit it off, and they become friends now for the rest of Mark Twain's life. And the same thing with William James. She was best friends with William James. And same thing with William Edward Du Bois. She was a friend of these guys. So she knew Maria Montessori, right? She was friends with Maria Montessori. So how can you be deaf and blind and figure out that somebody is a compassionate, honest, powerful, articulate individual? How you figure that out? I mean, I think there's a mystery here, and we haven't solved that mystery. You got to bring Helen back, and you got to ask that question: what's going on here? And I think from my background's more in science, so I think what's going on here is that Helen Keller had some sensory abilities that she was conscious of using that we're not conscious of using. We have them too, but we don't know we've got them. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of that. So I've got a friend, he's one of my best friends, Daniel Kish. He's a colleague of mine, and I wrote a book about two books about Daniel last year. The first book was part of the Nights for the Blind series, and was called Blind Man Watching, the echolocation legacy of Daniel Kish. Daniel co-authored both of those books, by the way. I couldn't take credit for writing those books because they were created by Daniel and I over many years of dialoguing. The second book was called Swedenborg's Dilemma, the origin of human duality, of our human minds. And that book I wrote because I wanted to examine Daniel's spirituality more. So it's a kind of a biological examination of Daniel Kish. And Daniel has two plastic eyes. So, he can take them out and show you his eyes. And in one documentary, he does that. So there's no vision going on here. But Daniel can stand in front of a scene and tell you what's in the scene. And he can walk around. He doesn't run into anything. How do you do that? But he does it, right? You can watch him do it. You can watch him describe a scene that's in front of you. And how do you do that without vision? So Daniel uses sonar, sends sonar out from his mouth, bounces out in the environment, comes back in, goes to his ears, and is processed back here in the back of his head in what's called the visual cortex. So he uses auditory images that are processed in the visual cortex. He's actually seeing using sound. So it was a couple of scientists who are famous, Mel Goodell at Western Ontario University and Dr. Laura Toller now at Durham University. They were working together at Western Ontario, and they did all these tests on Daniel, a lot of MRI tests, a lot of tests in anechoic chambers, which is a soundproof room, to try to figure out what was going on. And they did. And I wrote about it in his book, and it's pretty amazing what those scientists figured out, how Daniel was doing that. And Daniel's an expert himself. He's a world authority himself. He's on the same par as these neuroscientists. And he works with them on these experiments. So my point is this: Daniel uses echo perception to see, but so do you. It's just that you don't know you have that ability, okay? You have echo perception also. If I took you into an anechoic chamber, you would notice immediately that something was missing, okay? And what's missing are those echoes that you're used to. Okay, so one other example. This is a story that I really love. It's a very powerful story, and it comes from Michael Levin, who's a biologist and a computer scientist at Tufts University in Massachusetts. He's absolutely brilliant. And he tells this story. He said, so in your brain, there's two neurons. There's billions and billions of neurons, something like 100 billion neurons in the brain. And they're all connected. Okay. And so there's this neuron in the brain, and this neuron's a materialist. And there's another neuron next to him who's a mystic. And they have this debate, and the materialistic neuron says, well, look around, dude. Look at this. Look where we are. We got electrical currents, we got chemicals flowing, we got all these neurons, connecting to each other. This is reality. This is it. This is what reality is like. And the mystic neuron says, I can't help but feel that we're part of something bigger. And so the mystic neuron is right? Because these two neurons are part of something called the mind, and that mind runs a body, and that body's in another world. And now we're in this world, the materialists are saying, well, this is it. Look around. This is reality here. This is exactly it. And the mystics among us, like Emanuel Swedenborg, are saying, yeah, I just can't help feeling that we're part of something bigger. And like the neurons, they don't have the capacity, the way they're built, to understand. And I think that's the case with us as well. I don't think we're built to understand what this other thing is. We don't give up trying to figure it out, but I think that's the case. So what I want to suggest to you is that when Helen Keller meets somebody like Mark Twain that there's an energy field around us, and that energy field can separate, and Mark Twain's energy field can separate, and a portal opens up, and then there's a flow that can happen. And that flow is the flow of information, but it's the flow of emotions, it's the flow of love, it's the flow of knowing another personality. It's a knowing that happens. So I think something like that was going on with Helen Keller, and we don't know what it is yet. I think we're starting to get the message here that we have more senses than we know we have. Aristotle said we had 5 senses, and he threw us off for 2,500 years. He was right, but he was wrong. All right. So Helen Keller and Emanuel Swedenborg bring back this mystery and bring back the mysticism. We're born into mystery. We die in the mystery. It's the way it is. So bring it back, because you need to have that feeling of, oh my goodness, what is this? You need to have that feeling. Okay. So number 5, she's a justice warrior, right? And what that means, you're a justice warrior at a certain level of development. Usually happens in your early 20s, late teens, and you get a passion. Something really makes you mad. Something really needs to be fixed, and you get a sense of it, and you want to. You're on fire with trying to make things better, and it's a wonderful time. And you don't want to lose that fire, because you got to fight against dishonesty, against cruelty and indifference, against people who won't try to help you. It's a level of consciousness. It's go ahead and be a justice warrior. Just know you're doing it. That's all. So number 6 is, remember I said the reason that Helen Keller could be an optimist is because she knew the difference between faith and belief. So in the book, Swedenborg's Dilemma, The Origin of Human Duality, I talked about why this is, okay? Why there would be a difference between faith and belief. And you've heard of right brain and left brain, and that's similar, but it's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something new. And essentially, there are brain pathways and brain centers, and they operate 2 different minds, okay? Here's the best image that I have for you to help you remember this. So go into your mind, get yourself a full-length mirror in your mind, put it down, and you look at yourself in the full-length mirror, okay? Go ahead and project your best image of how you want to be, How do you want your body to be? What age, whatever, okay? So there you are. Now you're looking at yourself in the full-length mirror, and I'm going to go inside your mind with a Sharpie, and I'm going to draw on the mirror right down the center of you, okay? So notice, you're all one. We talk all the time about we're all one. Everything's one, oneness. Oneness is the goal. You hear that all the time. But the oneness turns out to be made out of 2, okay? You are made out of 2 matching halves, all right? That's a universal design. You see it everywhere. You have left and right molecules, for example. When I looked at the literature, and that's what I was doing in Swedenborg's Dilemma, if you look at the literature in psychology and philosophy, in poetry, in religion, in politics, doesn't matter where you look. Everywhere you look, the people who have gone into those fields with the greatest depth, like Jung did with psychology, you find this duality. It's everywhere. And they're dual words. You see these dual words. And what you find out is people just are using those words as if they mean the same thing. So you hear people talking about faith and belief, and they use them just interchangeably because they don't have a definition for them, or what definition they have is kind of vague or flows or whatever. And we talk about the ego and the self. We talk about attention. We talk about awareness. Attention, awareness. Yeah, it's all the same, isn't it? No, it's not. We have 2 brains, and the soul brain uses awareness, and the egoic brain uses attention. They use 2 different kinds of ways to understand the world. The soul brain is about experiences, and the egoic brain is about knowledge. And these dual words pop up everywhere. And you really need, the important thing here is what Helen Keller understood. She might not have been able to put it in those terms that I just did, but she is saying she's getting her optimism from her brain. That's her soulful brain. The egoic brain has murdered more people than disease. All those wars I talked about, they come from that egoic brain, okay? But you have two equal brains. They oscillate. That's why you can't meditate, because they keep changing, shifting around. So you've got these two brains, but the egoic brain has caused so much damage. It's because the ego needs a seer, that's you, and a seen. And it attaches emotions to what it sees, okay? And it forms groups of other egos, and they define themselves as important. And then if they're nation states, they can go on to do horrible things. And the record is horrendous, okay? The ego has also given us reason and all of our technologies. And so it's a mixed bag. But Helen Keller was using faith. She wrote a book about faith, okay? And so what she was saying in that book and what she is telling us and what we need to remember is that faith doesn't use words, it's about experience. And you gain wisdom from faith. I'm a writer, and when I know if my ego tries to write, I get writer's block. You can't write with your ego, you write with your soul because you write with a flow. And there is a mind that goes from the back over the top of the head where this is happening. That's where the flow mind is occurring. The egoic mind goes from the back to here. And it goes through the sides where the language is. All right. So when you bring back Helen Keller and you bring back Emanuel Swedenborg, you bring back this understanding of this duality. And you're really not going to understand faith unless you understand that it's the opposite of the ego. There's another image that I like. It's a Greek statue of Janus. It's a sculpture, and on one side is a face, and the exact same face is on the other side, looking that way. So you got one, you got faces looking in the opposite direction. And so the ego is one of the faces. And if you say to somebody, like a scientist or a materialist, hey, you got a soul. You got a soul mind. Did you know that? You really ought to know that, okay? And they will look all around and they don't ever see it. This back here. It's the opposite. The ego and the soul are off and on mechanisms. It's like walking, and that's really where this came from. A part of it came from is this fact that, so here's your 2 feet, and when you move this feet, it's on, but this one's off, and then you stop, and this one's on while this one's off, and that's how you walk. It's an alternating thing. And so the brain has this rhythm that goes on all the time in order for you to move through space. That's been going on for 500 million years, and that's where these two minds came from. That's my theory. I refer to myself as a cognitive philosopher. That way I can get away with a lot of musing and speculations. All right, so let's talk about the next one. Anne Sullivan understood something, okay? Anne Sullivan understood that there were two minds. So did Maria Montessori, so did Rudolf Steiner, who founded the Waldorf schools. They understood that you don't teach the soul mind the same way you teach the egoic mind, right? So the soul mind wants knowledge, and you sit at your desk and you learn how to do Braille and you learn how to finger spell. But the soul mind needs experiences. You got to do things and go places and meet people. You have to have experiences, and that generates wisdom. So Anne Sullivan knew that to take Helen Keller out and climb a tree, pick the apple off the tree and eat it, okay? She knew to go for a walk in the rain, okay? So, and in a way, she was one of the first developmental teachers, one of the first developmental psychologists. So what I'm saying to you is, first of all, Emanuel Swedenborg and Helen Keller are saying to us, we're each other's teacher, okay? You've got a mind and I can't get in it, okay? So you have to help me You have to help me know what you're figuring out. Okay. We need each other. So, and we can pull off miracles. Okay. Because we have a role model, right? We have Anne Sullivan who pulled off a miracle. All right. Number 8 here. This is one of the most amazing things. Okay. And this comes from Emanuel Swedenborg, straight from Emanuel Swedenborg. So he goes to heaven and he gets the information that the Bible is a symbolic, powerful document that contains these levels of consciousness in it. But he's told that he has within him a kingdom within. And the Swedenborgians will have to correct me here if I'm getting this wrong. But so here's the amazing thing. So he's writing in the 1700s, right? And so he's talking about the kingdom within to people who aren't even aware they have a mind. It's like not being conscious that you have echo perception. It's like a bird or a dog or a cat who goes about their business and does their behavior without any awareness that there's an entity called mind. So almost Swedenborg was saying, hey, guess what? Wake up, you've got a mind. It's a thing in there. There's a thing called a brain, and that makes, so the lungs breathe, the heart pumps, and the brain minds. So that's the first thing to understand about this kingdom within. It's saying you got a mind. Okay. The second thing is that this mind can know itself. The mind can watch itself. I learned a long time ago what it means to witness. So I can watch the words come out of my mouth. I can be a witness to my own behaviors as they happen. That's a skill in using your mind. Swedenborg said, okay, you can mold this thing called mind. Your mind can change itself. You can use your mind to do almost miraculous things. The mind, but he said, okay, if you've got this power, why not build a kingdom within that's a holy kingdom within? I mean, why don't you build a mind that's loving, compassionate, kind, empathetic, that's honest, that does its best to know what's real, honest in the confusion of trying to figure that out, and is trying to figure out what does it mean to be useful, trying to figure out what it means in Christianity to be of service. Okay, so one more thing about this kingdom within that I find very fascinating. I said, Aristotle's wrong. We don't have 5 senses. We've got many more senses. And we don't know what some of them are, but some of them are really essentially important, like how we connect non-verbally with others who are in the room and around with us, like Helen Keller was doing. But scientists found out this amazing thing. It just makes you sit back and think. So all of the neuroanatomy, all of the functions that enable you to move through this world that we're in, the way that we make words, for example, we know how to make words because we made the words. We know how the tongue and the jaw, and we know how to coordinate everything to make words that communicate with others. So what happened, because we've been making words for hundreds of thousands of years, was that same system that knows how to make words went inside your kingdom within and began to make words inside of your head. And it uses the same mechanism. The same neurons are firing in your head when you talk to yourself, all right? And that's a sense called proprioception, and I wrote about it in Swedenborg's Dilemma. But it's a very important sense to understand, because essentially what you built inside your mind is a space. The mind becomes a space, and you can navigate through that space. And as you do, you're navigating in your mind exactly how you navigate through the world. It's amazing, okay? So in your mind, you can travel backwards through history, through your memories. You can travel through potential futures. The mind does become a kingdom. So this whole idea of Swedenborg's that there's a kingdom within and it ought to be holy. Work on your kingdom within so that it's one thing to say, I'm supposed to be a loving person. It's another thing to actually be a loving person, every day with all the stresses that we have. And honesty is confusing. People will argue about what's real and what isn't real. Now, these days especially. And what does it mean to be useful? Somebody else's usefulness is our peril, maybe. I don't know. It's not easy. But anyway, this whole idea of having this amazing mind. And there's another element to this. So if I go get a radio and I hold it up and I turn it on and you'll hear music, right? Turn it off. Where'd the music come from? The music's already in the room. It's just that we didn't have the receiver to pick it up. Okay. And some people describe our kingdom within that way. All right. That it's a receiver, that it's connected not only to this environment, but to that other thing that we can't understand that I was talking about earlier. We're the neurons and we're part of something larger, but we don't know what it is. All right. That's really a powerful and a complicated thing. But so just two more things, okay? And they're just short. So Helen Keller she couldn't see, she couldn't hear. She absorbed Christianity, right? She was a really powerful Christian. And she heard that she was supposed to be loving, and she heard that she was supposed to be of service. If you have any kind of disability, I'm finding age now to be a kind of disability that people react to like they would to other kinds of disability. If you concentrate on having a service or a mission, it takes your attention away from whatever you're struggling with. Okay? We're all struggling with something, but if you've got blindness or deafness, or if you're quite elderly or whatever, you are struggling with the society's weight on you and their judgments. And you're not hearing, I appreciate who you are. I value who you are. You do have value. You're a human being. That's an amazing, you have a kingdom within. There's never been anything on this planet that had a kingdom within. It's just you and these other people with kingdoms within. So Helen Keller took that seriously. Okay. She took, you're supposed to be loving and you're supposed to be of service. She took it completely seriously. So if she ran into somebody who said, I'm a Christian, hallelujah, and you weren't acting like a Christian, if you were a racist, if you were being cruel, if you were going to war and killing people based on your beliefs, Helen Keller had a mirror for you. But she would hold that mirror up and she would say, I don't think you're a Christian. Look at how you behave. And boy, did that make people mad. When she was a weak woman, a cripple, oh my, then we love her. Oh, everybody loves her. Everybody, the miracle. But as soon as she opened up her kingdom within and said, are you going to really be a Christian? I mean, is that a real thing for you? Because if it is, you're not acting like it. Okay, so here's the mirror. You just have a look. So this mirror business got her in a lot of trouble, but also makes her a hero for the rest of us. So the final thing here, if I say to you, okay, this has been great, 10 things, and I've really enjoyed it, and I hope that you got a lot from it, and I really hope that you feed back to me because I want to grow. I want to have more experiences, and I want to know what's inside your kingdom within. But if I say, okay, yeah, that's it. Now I'm going to tell you a story. Okay, so put the pen down, just relax. You don't have to work your mind here. I'm just going to tell you a story. Well, if I do that, what happens? You do relax, right? Why? What's a story? Why do we love stories? Why do human beings love the stories? Why do we relax? A friend says, hey, let me tell you a story. We're happy. We're like full of attention. The reason is because a kingdom within that has a different kind of experience than you is going to tell you what their experiences are. You're going to hear from another universe here. And so you do want to know because that's how you find things out. And these stories are very powerful. We give each other stories. So Helen Keller's story with Anne Sullivan is one of the most powerful stories we've ever had in our culture. I'm talking about the world culture for all of humanity. So we can't let that fade away. That we have to keep that. We have to keep that alive. So I hope you enjoyed it. It's been fun for me. Thank you.